Hello and welcome to Frontline Conversations. My name is Bashir Abbas, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Mr. Gideon Levy. Mr. Levy is an internationally acclaimed journalist and author. He's an award winning columnist at Israel's Haaretz newspaper and is part of its editorial board. Mr. Levy, it's a delight to have you here. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mr. Levy, I wish to talk to you today about a range of issues, but particularly on Gaza and the ongoing ceasefire and seek your insights. But to just start things off, a three-phase ceasefire has technically been in effect between Israel and Hamas since the 19th of January of this year. But it is my understanding that Israel now seeks to modify the existing ceasefire deal, especially before moving on to phase two, and is now demanding that Hamas release half of the remaining hostages in captivity. And to force this, Israel has cut off effectively all humanitarian aid to Gaza. And other ministers in the Israeli government, such as Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, has said that this is a step in the right direction and that Israel should go ahead and cut off electricity and water as well. Mr. Levy, how do you read this? Can one say that there is a ceasefire at all today? How do you read these developments against the other developments that have happened thus far?
Let me, Bashir, be very clear. Israel violates the agreement that Israel had signed on, namely that after phase one, which was totally implemented by both parties, there will be phase two and three, which finally will include the full withdrawal of Israel from the Gaza Strip. Israel signed on it, and now Israel is violating. There's no other way to put it. Secondly, stopping the humanitarian aid is by itself a violation of the international law. No other way to put this, because starvation and preventing water and electricity by a whole population of 2.3 million people are all violation of the international law, are all crimes, inhuman, and also not only illegal, but also don't serve anything. So in any case, that's the way that I see it.
Thank you, Mr. Levy. I think that's as categorically as one can put it. But in addition to this, we've also seen other statements, such as from Foreign Minister Gideon Sar, where he says that Gaza must be demilitarized before Israel agrees to proceed on phase two of the ceasefire. Uh, Whether or not Netanyahu goes ahead and seeks new ceasefire terms, I think the real question here is whether or not President Donald Trump and his envoy, Mr. Steve Witkoff, will in any way force Mr. Netanyahu's hand to adhere to the existing terms. Because we all know the ceasefire itself came into place after a round of intense diplomacy featuring Mr. Witkoff earlier in January. Do you think that influence continues, or do you think otherwise?
First of all, I couldn't phrase it better, and you really don't need me because I agree to every word that you said now. The question is the only relevant question is not what the foreign minister of Israel said or didn't say, or the finance minister. The question is in Washington. And the question is, will Washington be decisive enough to force Israel to go for the second phase, as it did for the first phase? Because you rightly mentioned that without Mr. Witkoff, there wouldn't be even the first phase. And unfortunately, there are too many signs that the Americans let Israel decide, which means getting back to war. And I still hope that I'm wrong, but you hear more and more expressions from the White House that they are leaving it to Israel. If it's up to Israel, we will face a renewal of the war.
So you're saying that if Washington continues to allow Mr. Netanyahu to tread this path, then we are going to revert to a situation before the 15th of January.
Definitely. And maybe even worse this time. It might be even worse because on the 15th of January, there were still the influence and the remains of the former administration in Washington. And there was for sure no green light to Israel to commit crimes of war. Now, if they will not change, there is a very clear green light from Washington, letting Israel going wild.
I understand. Thank you, Mr. Levy. I think the ceasefire agreement is something that everybody is still trying to make sense of, because most of the doubts when the ceasefire first came to be implemented pertain to phase two, not so much as to phase one. But I'd like to shift your attention now more towards the plans for the day after in Gaza, because that's also a lot. That's also where a lot of global focus has been in the past few weeks, and in particular, I think just as recently as yesterday, again, Israeli Prime Minister Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu asserted that he backs U.S. President Trump's plan for the U.S. to take over Gaza and to turn it into a Riviera. But while he backs this, it is also very clear that the Palestinians and all of the Arab states and the Iranians certainly reject any such proposals. And I think the Arab League is presently meeting to consider alternative proposals that they can present to both Israel as well as to the United States. But the question really is, how open do you think President Trump himself is to alternative proposals? And I have the visuals in mind from the White House when the Jordanian king visited, and when Mr. Trump indicated what he has in mind again. And the Jordanian king repeated that there are alternative proposals in the works. But given that the Arab League is meeting now, do you think there is any shift in President Trump's appetite for alternative proposals, or there isn't?
First of all, we have to ask not only how open he is, but how serious he is. Because his original plan is not serious, not implementable. It was thrown to there without any preparation, without checking it with anyone else. It's very easy to offer, to make all kind of weird offers about the Riviera in the Gaza Strip and the paradise in Rafah and so forth. But you need some partners and you need some plan, and there is none. Neither partners, no plan. So I wouldn't take it too seriously. On the other hand, it really pushed the Arab states to find an alternative path, because still Donald Trump frightens everybody in the world, as we saw. In the last days, we see how Europe is frightened by Trump, not to speak about President Zelensky. So, in any case, we are facing a situation in which Trump saw a total unserious, almost I would say lunatic idea. And now everyone is trying to as a backlash, to find alternatives. And the question is, yeah, how will he stick to his original plan? The only obstacle is that it is not implementable, so he might stick to it, but where will the Riviera be exactly? And who is going to build it? And who is going to evacuate 2.3 million people? And who is going to absorb 2.3 million Palestinians? It's all questions which are still floating in the air without any answer, and there will be no answer to those questions.
Right. And it is also my understanding that the Jordanians and Egyptians have consistently reiterated the rejection of this plan. Jordan, especially, given the fact that the Palestinian refugee population in Jordan has a long political history and a complex relationship with the monarchy there. But I believe that the Jordanian refusal has been as staunch as it could be. But do you think there is any card that Washington could play at all to convince Jordan, or that is a moot point?
Look, we are dealing with two regimes which are quite fragile. The Jordanian even more than the Egyptian, but both are fragile. Both are not deep-rooted, and they have their weaknesses. Egypt is very, very poor, and so is Jordan. And the monarchy in Jordan is shaking for many years. I mean, on one hand, it's the most stable regime in the Middle East, but it's always under risk, under question mark, because finally, the majority of the population in Jordan are Palestinians. And for them, the king is not their aspiration. So both cannot say only no to the United States and not carry the consequences. Now, both also are getting quite big foreign aid from the United States. So they depend on the United States, but not only in money, also in political and military support. So on one hand, it's unquestionable that they cannot make it and they will not make it, but I would like to be in their shoes now. Neither they're Jordanian. Look, the Egyptian president didn't even dare to come to Washington because he knows what expects him. He might face another Zelensky guilty. So there is no easy question. The United States has a very strong leverage on those two weak regimes. On the other hand, I cannot imagine myself they will agree because this is suicidal. They cannot absorb 2.3 million Palestinians. It will unstable the whole region.
Absolutely. As you rightly pointed out, the Egyptians have refrained from going to Washington, at least at the same level. But on the other hand, the Egyptians have also been proactive in presenting an alternative proposal to the Arabs. I think Reuters reported yesterday that the Egyptians have presented a plan to the other states of the Arab League, which I think is currently being presented during their emergency summit, which of course rejects the US proposal for Gaza, but it looks to replace Hamas with what Egypt calls a governance assistance mission that will have interim bodies from, quote, Arab, Muslim, and Western states. Now, while the plan also calls for an international stabilization force and a multinational board to oversee both governance and security, Hamas very clearly has rejected the plan. I think Hamas leaders have also said that they haven't even heard or seen any such draft of the plan. And both Egyptian as well as Israeli officials also have refrained from issuing any comment on any such plan. But what is your view of such a plan? Can this be implemented at all?
I think the only goal of the Egyptian plan is to convince Donald Trump to give up his plan. Not much more than this. They want to show that they have an alternative, which by itself is not an alternative.
They're saying it is 150 pages.
Okay, you can also give 1,500 pages of nothing, of a program which is beautiful on the paper and is not implementable, is not achievable, because Hamas is the strongest and the only force in the Gaza Strip today. We may like it, we might not. But there is no alternative to Hamas. What does it mean Egypt will replace Hamas? How will it replace Hamas? With tanks, with air force? Hamas is not going to give up the Gaza Strip. It's their only outhold. It's their only place where they can really still be active and alive politically, even though they damaged militarily, but politically they are still the only acting organ in the Gaza Strip. So what does it mean replacing Hamas? How do you do it? Especially when in Gaza there is no other alternative. It's not like in Gaza there are the Republicans and the Democrats, and you might replace one with the other. In Gaza, Hamas right now is unreplaceable. There is no one else. Israel says no also the PA, and even if Israel would have said yes to the PA, I'm not sure the PA is capable of taking over Gaza. Hamas will not let the PA come into Gaza. So all those plans are beautiful on the paper, but I don't see them being implemented. I wish I will be found wrong. I wish one of those, because finally the goal must be rehabilitation of Gaza. Those 2.3 million people deserve some future, some perspective, some kind of hope, but I don't see it.
Yeah, Mr. Levy, we'll come to the Palestinian Authority in a bit, but what you just said about Hamas and Gaza resonates with me because I think one of the most famous one of the most famous assessments of the outgoing Biden administration was that Hamas has managed to completely replenish its strength in the Gaza Strip. Now, that has long been the American assessment. We haven't heard that assessment being repeated by this new administration in Washington. But do you think the Israeli view is the same? Because obviously, the Israeli government is not going to publicly share its own alignment with that assertion. But what do you think about Hamas's military and political capabilities today?
If Israel wouldn't believe that Hamas is still the strongest power in Gaza, Israel wouldn't renew the war. The whole excuse for renewing the war is that the so-called total victory was never achieved and cannot be achieved, and Hamas is still alive and kicking. By the fact that Israel is aiming at renewing the war, you understand that Israel understands that Hamas is still there.
Right, right. I suppose that makes sense. But since we're talking about the equation between Washington under the Trump administration as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu's office, but for a second, if we set aside the plans that or the so-called plan, if it can be called one, by President Trump for the Gaza Strip, and we consider rational pathways to peace, how likely is it that Israel will accept any plan at all, regardless of whether it calls for a rollback of Israel's settlement expansion in Gaza and in the West Bank or otherwise? But I think you'll understand what I'm really asking is what of the two-state solution today?
No, the two-state solution died long time ago, unfortunately. And it for sure cannot be revived in the present circumstances. On the contrary, we have a government in the last 15 years who did anything possible to destroy this solution, and it was destroyed. There are 700,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank who will never be replaced and never be evacuated. Without their evacuation, there is no room, no physical room for a Palestinian state, not for a viable one. And therefore, I think it's about time to stop dreaming and talking about the two-state solution because it will never be achieved. It's a train that left the station. And we have to look for a new discourse, for a new vision. And the only vision left, except of an apartheid state, is obviously a democracy between the river and the sea. I don't see any alternative to this. It's a long way to go, but at least let's start talk about it. Let's start dream about it. Let's start realize that the only choice now is between an apartheid state between the river and the sea or a democracy between the river and the sea.
So, if I were to ask you to reconcile that assessment with the other assessment of Hamas continuing to be one of the most, if not the most dominant forces in Gaza, and Hamas has consistently been clear that it cannot accept any version of the Israeli state. Of course, Hamas's own views have evolved across the last decade, but post October 7th, the global understanding has been that they continue with their rejection of Israeli sovereignty. Given that context, how would you explain the end of the two-state solution?
The end is in facts on the ground, not in a position of Hamas or position of Israel.
Will Hamas accept this one state that is not Palestine?
First of all, that's their claim to fame. I mean, from day one, they were calling. The problem is that they want an Islamic state. And this will be obviously out of the question. Nobody will be pleased by the one state solution. The Jews will have to give up their dream of a Jewish state. The Palestinians will have to give up their dream about the Palestinian state, and the Hamas will have to give up his dream about an Islamic state. But I'm asking again and again, what is the alternative? And right now, look, I am so open. If someone will come and tell me, listen, the two-state solution may be revived, I'll be so happy. But I don't see it happening. And to continue to speak about a dead body as if it can get back to life is just playing to the hands of the occupation. Because by the end of the day, we all play this game. The Americans, the EU, the PA, India, any other country, Israel, even in certain times. We always say two-state solution, but not now. Well, one day, we don't know when. And by this, we give the illusion that there is a solution. It's only a question of timing. But there is no solution because the two-state solution is dead. How can you use it as a vision for the future when there are 700,000 Jewish settlers there? And I don't know anyone serious who believes that they can be evacuated. They are the strongest actor in Israel's politics. It is a violent, very powerful group in Israel politics, unless, the Americans will come one day and say, evacuate the settlers immediately. I don't see this happening either. So again, if the two-state solution can be revived, I'll be the first supporter. I don't see it happening. And therefore, we have to realize that we are left with two alternatives, apartheid state or a democracy. And we all should choose. If it's about an apartheid state, so, we have it by now and we can continue with it until the world will say its word about the second apartheid state after South Africa. But if we don't accept an apartheid state as a legitimate phenomena, which I don't, then we have to realize that the only alternative is a democracy. And we have to start to talk about it and build it.
Right. So you're saying that the fait accompli on the ground is so strong that the two-state solution has effectively been scuttled.
So
I I understand with that reasoning, but as you yourself pointed out, the lingua franca for support for a potential Palestinian state continues to be the two-state solution across the official positions of states, including that of India.
it's a lip service, Bashir. It's a hollow lip service. It's very easy to say two-state solution. It sounds so good. It is a good solution. But if we continue to say, what did the world do, and Israel included, to implement this two-state solution in the last 50 years? Nothing. The only one who were active about it were the settlers, and they achieved a lot. And now it's irreversible.
Yes, and will I be right in saying that when Ariel Sharon and subsequent Israeli leaders sort of led up to 2005, 2006, when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, you see the percentage of total Israeli settlers was far lower than it is today, and even then it was quite difficult. So today it is bordering on impossible. Would you share that assessment?
Absolutely. No, before Oslo, after Oslo, Israel tripled and more the number of settlers. So Oslo was a trap. We didn't know it, including me, but it was a trap because the fact is that after Oslo, Israel had tripled the number of settlements. And one should understand, if you want to know the real intentions of Israel, check its policy about the settlements. Because you don't build settlements in order to evacuate them. You build them in order to prevent the Palestinian state. This is the one and main purpose of the settlements. And Israel is building until this very day. More and more and more in the last 1.5 years, you wouldn't recognize the West Bank. How many illegal outposts are there over every hill almost?
And if I'm not wrong, I think about 3 to 4 months before October 7th, Prime Minister Netanyahu had given Mr. Smotrich an even freer hand to come up with a larger plan for settlement expansion, especially in the West Bank.
Absolutely. That's the raison d'etre of this government, of this coalition.
Right. I think you've made that position pretty clear, Mr. Levy. But I think I'd now like to revert to the brief conversation that we were having on the Palestinian Authority. And this is a question that has been asked across the past 17 months at several points, that is the Palestinian Authority finished? We hardly find any mention of the Palestinian Authority in any of these reported proposals for a day after in Gaza. And all this is while, in the words of one of your recent pieces for Haaretz, while Israel is Gazafying the West Bank. This is what you had also asserted. So, what really is the future of the Palestinian Authority, which remains entrenched in the West Bank?
First of all, what is the present of the Palestinian Authority. It is totally irrelevant, except of here and there fighting Hamas on behalf of Israel, a subcontractor of Israel. Where is the Palestinian Authority? Where is the leadership? It became totally irrelevant. Totally irrelevant. I mean, if someone can change because the PA is calling for dramatic reform, first of all, from the point of view of generation, Mahmoud Abbas generation has to go. They didn't achieve much for the people, and they have to go. And I don't see it happening. Even if you speak now about the successor, the possible successor of Abbas, who is almost 90, all of them are from the same school. All of them are from the same generation, more or less. So they're 10 years younger. But that's the school that brought the Palestinians to the place today in which there is no perspective, no hope, and quite lonely in the world. I mean, there is a lot of empathy toward the Palestinians, more than ever, all over the world, especially in the last 1.5 years ago. But how do you translate this empathy, this popular empathy, into political steps? This wasn't achieved yet because governments are still pro-Israelis, governments are still pro-Zionists, governments are still turning their back to the Palestinian cause.
You're right that there have been a number of polls coming out of the West Bank in the years even preceding October 2023, which have repeatedly reaffirmed the wide unpopularity of the Palestinian Authority and Abu Mazen himself in the West Bank, even if people continue to respect Abu Mazen as a political figure that I believe they do not continue to have faith in the Palestinian Authority's ability to administer without being corrupt. But at the same time, it is still the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas who remains the point of contact for formal communication with the state of Palestine for the rest of the world. And that by itself, I think, is a key pillar of its legitimacy. Do you think that can change at any point? Because what other options are states like even India left with apart from coordinating with the Palestinian Authority?
Yeah, but that's a tragedy because it's a very hollow tool. Yes, every statesman who come to Israel spends 2-3 hours to go to Ramallah and to meet Abbas. So what? There are embassies of the PA all over the world. Their voice is being heard in the UN on behalf of the PA. Yes, but it is very hollow because behind this there is nothing. No leadership, no plan, no capability to take over. I don't blame them. Maybe they are acting in an impossible world in which Israel really does not let them any kind of space to become a government, to become a meaningful political body. But the outcome is that it's totally hollow. Look, I'm traveling in the last 35 years, at least once a week in the West Bank. There is no PA. I mean, here and there, you see maybe they are in charge of cleaning the streets and some schools, some health care, which is also very poor, but it doesn't function.
Right, and I, I think this is also in line with your reasoning again in your column where you say that if a third Intifada does break out in the West Bank, then Israel would certainly have instigated it. Uh, it almost feels like a counterintuitive question, but what are the chances of a third Intifada? And even if it does come to pass, given how Israel has prosecuted its war in the last 17 months, what is to say that it will not unleash immense kinetic force to just nip the whole thing in the bud? And the fact that a third Intifada will not achieve what the first and the second did.
No, I totally agree with you. It will not achieve anything like the first and the second one. And it will not look like the first and the second one, because in the first and the second one, there was a leadership, both local leadership and national leadership. There was some kind of organization running all this. Israel had smashed the Palestinians in the second intifada, and very little has remained. And now Israel is also really in the most brutal way breaking the last remains of any kind of resistance. First in the refugee camps, now camp after camp. They are physically destroying the refugee camps, which were always the focus of resistance. And I don't see how can an intifada in the version that we knew it from 2000, 2002, repeat itself. It will not repeat itself, but it will explode on maybe on an individual basis. And we see it even now, because life in the West Bank in the last 17 months is not alive. And people cannot take it anymore. And you hear more and more people who say, we cannot take it anymore. We have nothing to lose. And that's very dangerous, because it might explode. It will not be exploded as an organized resistance, but it will be a very harsh and painful individual resistance. And we see signs to it already now.
Right. So if I've gotten you correctly, what you're saying is it won't be a cohesive, organized mass movement, but an explosion of anger at an individual level, which will be harder to control and harder to predict. That's what you're saying.
Like of people who have nothing to lose, but really nothing to lose.
Hmm. Right. Uh, I think since you also mentioned that life in the West Bank is in despair, but compared to that, if you look at just Gaza alone, I think it's too early to talk of reconstruction. But despite that, the United Nations has already estimated the bill of reconstruction in Gaza to be at least 53 billion US dollars. And the fact that all of the states that have expressed an interest in helping to reconstruct Gaza on either side of geopolitical divides, whether Turkey or the Gulf states or even the United States itself, no matter how bizarre its plan sounds, it's clear that almost all of them have some version of rejection of Hamas. But the fact that this amount of capital for reconstructing Gaza cannot come from anywhere else. So, would you not say that both of these facts are sort of running against each other? Because as long as Hamas exists in Gaza, and as you say that it continues to be there and potentially will be there, the funds for reconstructing Gaza will also not come. Do you think that is a fair assessment?
A very fair assessment. And nobody knows how to get out of it, because Israel went to this war without having any clue what will be the day after, and without any plan for the day after. And we are almost in the day after, and there is a vacuum in which Hamas is the only actor, and there will be no reconstruction with Hamas, as you rightly said, and there will be no scenario in which Hamas will give up its outhold in the Gaza Strip. It's hold in the Gaza Strip, because that's his only asset now. So it's a very complicated situation now, which I don't see how do you. Donald Trump thinks that he can just move from one place to the other, 2.3 million people, and everything will be solved, and the Riviera will come to light. But obviously, this is childish and ridiculous.
Right. Mr. Levy, I just want to double click on something you said when responding that Israel went into this war without any real plan. Now Gaza is one front. We saw that across the 17 months, Israel also launched another war in Lebanon against Hezbollah, eliminated almost its entire senior leadership rather successfully, and now is in a ceasefire with Hezbollah despite some sporadic bombardment. But on the other hand, it appears that Israel is threatening war against the interim administration in Syria because Mr. Netanyahu has called for a complete demilitarization of southern Syria. Now, at first glance, this seems to be rather unacceptable to the interim administration if you look at the outcomes of the national dialogue, which was recently held in Damascus. But do you think Israel is also committed to expanding the current war and going even further into Syria? Because so far HTS has sort of refrained from really involving itself in the war in Gaza or supporting Hamas beyond rhetoric. Do you think that there is the risk of entanglement in the future should Israel go ahead?
It's not question of thinking, it's question of looking at what Israel is doing. Instead of trying to open a new chapter with the new regime in Syria, which at least for the moment seems quite promising, I must tell you. Maybe we will be all disappointed. Maybe it's just a illusion. But right now, until now, they didn't do what? Mistake. And it seems like they are looking for a new future for Syria. Why not to join this future? Why to sabotage it? Why to see the weakness of Syria as an opportunity to conquer and to beat and to kill and to destroy, instead of seeing the weakness of Syria as an opportunity to make peace with Syria? But you know, all those things in Israel are not even discussed. For Israel, under the current government, with the current public opinion, I must say, the only language that Israel is speaking now is the language of using military power, military force, nothing but this.
Traditionally, I think the Israeli government has made it clear that they are more comfortable with tolerating Assad
So
than with Islamists in opposition. But now those same Islamists are in power, technically. But across the last few weeks, they've also been taking some steps to sort of show that they are not in alignment with earlier Iranian-led plans in Syria, and that they wouldn't allow for the axis of resistance to continue operating that the way that they used to in the past. But clearly, these actions alone have not increased any trust that Israel would have in these actions.
sure. Iran is absent in Syria. Iran is out of Syria. That's another reason why Israel should have taken this opportunity to open a new chapter with Syria. But again, if you believe that your only language is the language of using military force, if you believe that you can live only on your sword, and that's the case of Israel, all those things are just either traps or illusions or lunatic dreams of leftists, but none of them is serious, because finally the only way for Israel to exist and to survive is by its military force. Kill as much as we can, destroy as much as we can, conquer as much as we can. That's our only guarantee. That's the mindset in Israel.
Are there any sources of pressure at all on the Netanyahu-led government in Israel currently?
Only the American one, and that's the only relevant pressure, because all the other pressures are not relevant to him. There's a strong measure on Netanyahu, pressure on Netanyahu to get to release all the hostages. There is a strong pressure in Israel to replace Netanyahu, a big, massive opposition. But that's not his political base, and therefore he couldn't care less about it. And his political base is very solid and will accept him no matter what he will do. And therefore it is the chances are so weak to replace him. The chances are so weak to put pressure on him. The only pressure that might change his policy is the American pressure, but I don't see it coming.
Which is not forthcoming very
I
clearly.
exactly.
Right. Now, again, a traditional understanding has been that if Netanyahu should stay committed to the ceasefire, then that political base which you talk of is going to be harmed. Uh, Now, on the other hand, should Mr. Netanyahu do what he's currently doing, which is push for other forms of the ceasefire that allow Israel to continue its operations or make it virtually impossible for the other side, which is Hamas, to accept any terms that Israel desires, then that continuation of war is necessary for Netanyahu. Then would you say that the logical end of this war is a fundamental solution in Mr. Netanyahu's view to this whole question of Israel and Palestine? That there won't be any stopping the war until Israel itself establishes its own dominance in both the West Bank and Gaza, as it has tried to do.
In Netanyahu's eyes, sure, but it's more than this. As you rightly mentioned, it's not only the West Bank and not only Gaza. It is also Syria and even Iran. So as long as all those goals will not be achieved, Israel will not sit still.
Since you mentioned Iran, I'll allow myself a very slight detour because the new Iranian government, led by Mr. Masoud Pezeshkian, has been rather keen in showing to the world that it is open to engage, especially Western states. Now, the Trump administration has not given any sign of encouraging Israel to go into a conventional war against the Islamic Republic of Iran. But how would you explain the Israeli and the American relationship with Iran today and the chances of even an escalated conflict in the near future?
Totally unclear. There is really a lot of ambiguity around it. We don't know what Donald Trump wants. He claims he wants to get to a deal, but did he put a veto on an Israeli attack over Iran? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And will he assist Israel in such an attack? Might be. So here we are really in the darkness, and it's very hard to tell. Israel is obviously trying to push the United States into a military operation. As usual, Israel does not believe in any kind of agreement and any kind of diplomacy. And the question is, where does Donald Trump stand? And unlikely other issues, here he wasn't very, very clear and loud. Not yet. He, as I said, he mentioned the political solution as the favorable solution for him, but he didn't exclude a military operation by Israel.
Right. Mr. Levy, I'm also a great admirer of your work, and I've read your 2010 book, The Punishment of Gaza, and it is incredible that at the time you had called Gaza a gruesome experiment performed on living human beings. I think you had also described Israel's Operation Cast Lead as a wild onslaught upon the most helpless population in the world. This was 15 years ago. And now Israel's 17-month-long war has killed at least 48,000 people, according to Gaza's own health ministry. Uh, you've already clarified that there are no real sources of political pressure on Israel, but how about Israeli society? Is there no feeling that resistance to the Israeli government at large, whether being led by Mr. Netanyahu or not, is increasing? Is social pressure on Israel's political establishment increasing, or is it not?
Something happened in Israel, something very crucial happened in Israel on the 7th of October 2023. Aside of the horrible crimes which were committed and the terrible price that Israel had paid, Israel public opinion, I would even say the zeitgeist, the spirit of Israel changed dramatically, mainly in its so-called peace camp. They almost all shifted toward the right wing. The 7th of October was a terrible development in terms of maintaining some kind of hope among the so-called sane Israelis, so-called moderate Israelis, so-called liberal Israelis. Most of them lost it. Not all of them, but most of them. And it changed Israel. in a dramatic way. And today, most of the Israelis would support continuing the war. Most of the Israelis would support any kind of war. And there is no real opposition to war. There is opposition to Netanyahu. There is opposition which calls to release the hostages, obviously. But there is no room for realizing that we are committing crimes of war, no guilt feelings, no shame at all. Israel really turned into something that we never saw before, because there were always some senses of shame and guilt, not anymore.
Mr. Levy, are you saying that there is a possibility that if all of the hostages, both alive and unfortunately dead, are returned, even after that, support for Israel's war against Gaza might continue?
First of all, any war in the history of Gaza, or not only Gaza, any war that Israel launched got automatic support but is by Israeli public opinion. If there was resistance, if there was criticism, it was always in the later stages, not in the first stages. Israelis automatically support war. It's much easier for them to support war rather than to support peace. Peace always had a bigger opposition than war. Even though war calls for much a heavier price, but still the Israelis just see the so-called price of peace and never see the price of war. So in this term, don't forget that most of the Israelis lost any faith in the Palestinians, in their humanity, in even perceiving them as human beings after the 7th of October. And it's very hard to correct it, very hard, not for the short run.
Thank you, Mr. Levy. This has been a very enriching and invaluable conversation. But before I let you go, just a last line of questioning, since we've discussed the political and social aspects of how Israel views the current war, whether in Gaza or otherwise. But the last question has to be military. We remember that Netanyahu wasn't fully on board with the views of the IDF and the IDF senior leadership and his former Minister of Defense on what the day after plan is for Gaza. There is evidently some discomfort in how the IDF views its own position in Gaza and its ability to continue military occupation almost indefinitely. What happened to that resistance from the military establishment? Has that completely died down? Has Netanyahu's view of the Israeli occupation uh, subsumed any such resistance, especially after firing his former Minister of Defense? Where has that military view gone?
First of all, the military changed by itself. There's a new generation of generals and commanders, high-rank commanders.
Even after
So,
you have done?
yes, sure. It's a process which is going on years. More and more settlers are in higher positions. The settlers took it as a project to serve in the army and to get to the highest ranks. And you see it already happening. For example, the highest commander of the West Bank is a settler. And you can feel it in every decision that he's getting. But that's only one side of it. The army by itself is traumatized from the 7th of October, obviously, because nobody can deny that that was the greatest fiasco ever in the history of military army. And the correction comes not from really understanding that in the base of it was a terrible arrogance. In the base of all the fiasco, there is a big, big arrogance believing that Israel can live only on its sword and will live forever only on its sword. But the right conclusions are not being taken. On the contrary, what we say in Hebrew, what was not achieved by force will be achieved by more force. And that's the way of thinking now. And the army is on one hand beaten, but on the other hand gets now a lot of support to be more offensive, more cruel, more brutal, and more barbaric. There is no more any criticism about being barbaric in Israeli society. So they see it also, like the settlers, as an opportunity. And the army is taking this opportunity, at least part of the army, because you can do now whatever you want in the army. Last week, a group of soldiers, and it's not only high ranks, the lowest rank can do whatever they want. So a group of soldiers last week came to few villages in the West Bank and just evacuated the families without any order, nothing. And today it was published that nobody will even being brought to justice for this. So soldiers understand they can do whatever they want
with impunity.
And that's the spirit now.
And all of it is justified as a post-October 7th phenomenon, as I think.
Absolutely. Now, after the 7th of October, we have the right to do whatever we want.
Right. Mr. Levy, this has been a great discussion. We've covered.
Even not a very happy one, or a very hopeful one.
Unfortunately, as you earlier said, this is the zeitgeist of this topic,
Yes.
and we have to state things as it is. And stating things as it is something that you have very pragmatically done across the decades. And I really wish you well, and I hope you continue your good work for as long as possible. Thank you.
I'll do my best. Thank you for having me, Bashir. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you.